She had him thrown out of his own world. The security guards didn't hesitate. Two men in black suits took Marcus Hale by the arm, gently but firmly, the way professionals handle an embarrassment, and guided him toward the exit doors of the Grand Palladian Hotel's ballroom, while 400 of the city's most influential people watched. His wife stood at the center of the room in a gown that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She had already decided what he was. She had already looked at the man she married and seen someone who didn't belong in the room she had so carefully constructed. What Vivian Hale did not know, what none of them knew, was that the room itself, the hotel, the foundation hosting the gala, and 3 of the 7 major corporate sponsors whose banners hung from the raftered ceiling had all been quietly, methodically funded by the man being shown to the door. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome. Hit that like button because this story is going to take you somewhere you did not expect. And drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened in that ballroom, you have to understand how Marcus Hale became invisible to the woman who once claimed he was the only person who truly saw her. Marcus was 43 years old on the night of the gala, though he could have passed for someone a few years younger, not because he worked at it, but because he carried himself with the relaxed economy of a man who had nothing left to prove. He was not a physically imposing person. Medium height, lean in the unhurried way of someone who walked everywhere and never thought twice about it. He wore glasses he'd had for 6 years and kept meaning to replace. His haircut was adequate. His clothing was almost aggressively unremarkable. If you sat next to him on a commuter train, you would not look twice. If you shared an elevator with him, you might assume he was an accountant or perhaps a mid-level manager at a company that made something sensible and unexciting. You would not assume that his personal investment portfolio contained stakes in over 60 companies, that he had built and exited 3 technology firms before the age of 35, or that his estimated net worth, never publicly confirmed, quietly known in certain circles, was approximately $4.2 billion. Marcus had not made his money by being loud. He had made it by being patient, precise, and nearly impossible to read. He had a gift for identifying the moment before value became visible to everyone else, for seeing the architecture beneath the surface of things when others still saw rubble. His mentor, an elderly venture capitalist named Gerald Fenn, who had retired to coastal Portugal a decade earlier, had once told him that the most dangerous investor in any room was the one nobody was watching. Marcus had taken that observation and built a philosophy around it. He had met Vivian Cho at a charity auction 9 years ago. She was 34 then, a rising event coordinator who had just launched her own firm, elegant and composed in a way that suggested she had been preparing for rooms like that one her entire life. Marcus had been sitting at a corner table, nursing a glass of sparkling water and quietly observing the dynamics of who talked to whom and why, when she sat down next to him and said, without preamble, that she found the whole event desperately performative. He had laughed, genuinely, openly, the kind of laugh that surprised him because he so rarely produced the real version in public. They had talked for 2 hours and left before the auction concluded. He married her 14 months later. For the first 4 years, it had been good. Vivian was brilliant in her domain. She understood social architecture the way Marcus understood financial architecture, as a system of relationships, pressures, and carefully placed supports. She built her firm, Vivian Cho Events, into one of the most sought-after luxury event companies in the city, and Marcus supported her completely, asking for nothing in return except her company, which he valued enormously. He stayed in the background because he genuinely preferred it there, not because anyone demanded it. The change had been gradual. So gradual that Marcus had spent the better part of 18 months trying to determine exactly when it had begun. He thought it might have been when Vivian hired Dominic Farrell as her creative director. Dominic was 40, expensively maintained, and possessed of the specific brand of confidence that mistakes volume for substance. He wore his success like a costume and spoke about money in the way people did when they had enough of it to be comfortable, but had never had so much of it that it became simply a tool. He came from old professional money, a family of architects and corporate attorneys, and he had very decided opinions about what kind of people belonged in what kind of rooms. Dominic had met Marcus twice. Both times he had treated Marcus with the benign disinterest of a man who had already filed him under a category and moved on. The category, Marcus understood, was something like supportive spouse, limited relevance. Vivian had not corrected this impression. At first, Marcus assumed she was simply busy. Later, he understood she had made a choice. The Gala had been Vivian's largest project to date. The Hartwell Foundation Gala for Urban Arts Education was an annual event that had, under previous management, been a respectable mid-tier affair attended by a reliable contingent of local philanthropists and art supporters. When the Hartwell Foundation approached Vivian 2 years ago about taking over the production, she had seen it for what it was: a platform, an opportunity to reposition both the event and herself at the center of the city's philanthropic elite. She had spent those 2 years building toward this night with the focused intensity of someone who understood that certain evenings only came around once. Marcus had known about the gala, of course. He had heard about it daily for months. He had listened attentively over dinner to the ongoing negotiations with the Grand Palladian, the disputes with caterers, the delicate choreography of seating arrangements designed to flatter the egos of people who required flattering. He had nodded and asked questions and meant every one of them. What Vivian did not know was the extent of Marcus's connection to the evening. The Hartwell Foundation itself had been in quiet financial difficulty 4 years ago, its endowment eroded by a combination of poor investment decisions and declining major donor interest. It had been rescued by an anonymous gift of $8 million, funneled through a philanthropic trust that Marcus had established a decade earlier and operated under the name of a holding company called Meridian Crest. The Foundation's board knew Meridian Crest as a reliable and discreet benefactor. They did not know Meridian Crest was Marcus Hale's instrument. Marcus had structured it that way deliberately, not out of false modesty, but because anonymity in philanthropy was philosophically important to him. Gerald Fenn had taught him that a gift that required acknowledgement was, at its core, a transaction. The Grand Palladian Hotel was majority-owned by a real estate investment consortium in which Marcus held a 41% stake. He had helped broker the original acquisition financing 9 years ago and remained the single largest individual investor in the property group. 3 of the 7 corporate sponsors whose materials decorated the ballroom, Anslow Capital, Veritas Media Group, and a boutique sustainable fashion label called Orvine, all had Marcus Hale somewhere in their cap tables, in 2 cases as a founding investor, and in one as the person who had prevented the company from folding during a particularly brutal market correction 4 years prior. None of this had been arranged for this evening. It was simply the accumulated geography of a career built on seeing value in things before they announced themselves. The gala had grown up inside the garden Marcus had been quietly tending for years, and neither Vivian nor Dominic nor any of the 400 guests had thought to wonder about the soil. The evening had begun with a particular quality of tension that Marcus recognized but had not expected to encounter in his own home. He had come downstairs at 7:15, dressed in a dark suit that was genuinely, quietly excellent, the kind of suit that rewarded close attention but made no claims on casual notice. He had been looking forward to the evening in a measured way, understanding it would be Vivian's night and content to stand at the periphery and watch her work. She was extraordinary at events. Whatever else had grown complicated between them, that had never changed. Vivian had been in the entryway with Dominic and 2 assistants, running through a final checklist with the focused authority of a conductor reviewing a score minutes before performance. She looked extraordinary. The gown was deep sapphire, architectural in its construction, doing precisely what it was designed to do. Marcus had started to say so when Dominic looked up from the tablet he was holding, and his expression cycled through something that was not quite surprise and not quite contempt, but lived in the territory between them. "Vivian," Dominic had said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering an opinion he was confident would be received favorably. "Are guests bringing +1s this evening?" The question was not aimed at Marcus directly. It was aimed at Vivian, about Marcus in front of Marcus. It was the kind of social cruelty that operated through grammar, the conversion of a person into a subject of a question rather than a party to a conversation. Vivian had glanced at Marcus and then away, the way you glanced at something that didn't require a full assessment. "He'll be fine," she said. "Not 'he'll be wonderful,' or 'I'm so glad he could come,' or 'Marcus, you look handsome. He'll be fine," as though his presence were a logistical factor that had been accounted for and neutralized. Marcus had said nothing. He had simply adjusted the cufflink on his right sleeve, a small, unhurried gesture, and waited. In the car, Dominic had sat in the front seat and briefed Vivian on the final guest arrivals from his tablet, while Marcus sat in the back and watched the city move past the window with the expression of a man who was thinking about several things simultaneously and finding none of them surprising. The Grand Palladian's ballroom was, by any reasonable measure, magnificent. Marcus had always thought so, though he had never said this to anyone connected to the hotel's ownership group. The restoration of the original plasterwork ceiling had been a significant line item in the 2019 budget and had been entirely worth it. He noted, as he always noted when he entered the room, the particular quality of the light at the upper registers of the space, warm and diffused, the result of a lighting redesign he had quietly advocated for through the property group's operations committee. It was a good room. He was glad it had been treated well. The first hour had been manageable. Marcus had moved through the pre-dinner reception with the ease of someone who had attended hundreds of events and understood their rhythms without requiring their validation. He had spoken briefly with a city councilman he knew slightly, more substantively with a woman who ran an arts education nonprofit he had funded anonymously through Meridian Crest for 3 years. She did not know this, and he found her genuine passion for the work more interesting than the conversation would have been if she had. He had accepted a glass of sparkling water and stood near the windows that overlooked the terrace, content. Dominic found him there. Not to speak to him, but to speak near him, he arrived with 2 men Marcus didn't recognize and positioned himself at a conversational angle that excluded Marcus without requiring an explicit act of exclusion. It was architectural in its way. Marcus observed it with something that was not quite amusement but lived in that neighborhood. "The foundation has come a long way," one of the men was saying. "I remember this event when it was held in the Meridian Room at the Whitmore. Respectable, but limited." "Vivian transformed it," Dominic said, and there was genuine pride in his voice, which Marcus noted because it was not the part of Dominic that bothered him. "She understood what it needed to be and then simply made it that. The access she has now, the donor relationships she's built, it's remarkable, really." "And the anonymous endowment gift," the second man said. "That changed everything. 8 million. Do you know where that came from?" Dominic smiled the smile of a man who liked being the one who knew things. "Meridian Crest, some investment holding group. They've been a shadow sponsor of the arts community for years. Nobody knows who it is. The foundation's board plays it very close. But whoever it is, they have extraordinary taste and no interest in the spotlight." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a recalibration toward significance. The Grand Palladian connection is similar. The property ownership group has been quietly supportive of the foundation's events for years. Reduced rates, in-kind contributions. It all builds something. "Remarkable," said the first man. "It is," said Dominic. Marcus finished his sparkling water and set the glass on a passing tray. The moment arrived in the second hour, during the dinner service, at a table that Vivian had not seated Marcus at. He had been placed at a side table, table 11, with people who were pleasant enough and who clearly understood they had also been placed there because the closer tables required a different category of guest. He did not mind the placement itself. He minded what it communicated, and what it communicated was that Vivian had made a decision about where he belonged in the room she had built. He had been walking back from a quiet conversation with the foundation's executive director, a warm, capable woman named Sandra Achebe, who had no idea she was speaking to the man whose trust had rescued her organization, when Dominic intercepted him near the edge of the room. "Marcus," the name alone, deployed as a full stop. "I need to be honest with you about something, and I'd rather do it here than let it become a thing." He spoke with the confident gentleness of someone delivering an editorial judgment they had pre-approved. "Vivian has worked incredibly hard for this evening. This is a room full of people who are evaluating her on a very specific set of criteria. What she does, who she presents herself as, who she's connected to." A brief surgical pause. "I say this with genuine respect. Tonight may not be the right environment for you to be circulating. You'd be doing her a kindness by perhaps finding a quiet corner and letting her work." The room buzzed and flickered at the edges of this statement, the way rooms did when they contained something worth paying attention to. Marcus looked at Dominic for a long moment, not through him, not past him, at him with the direct, unflinching attention of someone who was deciding exactly how much of himself to reveal. "I appreciate you being direct," Marcus said. "Of course. I'll keep that in mind." It was not an agreement, but Dominic heard it as one, because Dominic heard most things as confirmation of conclusions he had already reached. 20 minutes later, Marcus was standing near the bar at the back of the ballroom, not trying to be seen, simply existing in a space he had every right to inhabit, when Vivian appeared at his side with an expression he recognized. It was her management face, the one that meant she had identified a problem and was now addressing it efficiently. "Marcus," her voice was low, event-modulated. "Dominic mentioned he spoke with you." "He did. I think he has a point." She did not look at him while she said it. She was scanning the room the way she always did at her events, monitoring, adjusting, maintaining. "This is a really important night. These people," a slight gesture toward the tables, the gowns, the architecture of aspiration that she had constructed around them all. "They have very specific expectations. I need to be a certain thing tonight. Do you understand?" "I think I do," Marcus said. "I'm not saying you should leave." A pause. "But if you could perhaps—" "Keep to the edges," Marcus said. She looked at him then, briefly. Something moved across her face that might have been discomfort if she'd allowed it space to develop. She didn't. "I have to get back," she said, and she went. Marcus stood at the bar and accepted another glass of water from a server who had no idea who he was and treated him with the easy, professional warmth extended to all guests equally, which Marcus found, in that moment, quietly restorative. He was not at the edges when it happened. He was walking, purposefully, unhurriedly, toward the table where the Hartwell Foundation's board chair, a man named Richard Cawley, was seated. Marcus had something he wanted to say to Richard, something that had occurred to him during Sandra Achebe's remarks about the Foundation's next expansion phase. It was a useful thought, the kind that only arrived when you had been listening properly. He wanted to offer it before the evening ended. He did not reach the table. The two security guards were professionals. Marcus understood this immediately. Their body language was de-escalatory. Their grip was firm, but not aggressive, and they had clearly been briefed on the situation with enough specificity to know which man to approach. They materialized from two slightly different angles, which suggested coordination, which suggested this had been organized rather than improvised. "Sir," said the taller one, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, and his voice was level and entirely without performance. "We've received a request from the event organizer." The man had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "We've been asked to escort you out for the remainder of the evening." From across the room, Vivian Hale stood with a small, careful group near the stage, and her posture carried the particular quality of deliberate non-attention. She was looking elsewhere. She had made a decision and returned to her evening. Dominic beside her was speaking into her ear, and whatever he was saying produced a small, controlled nod. Marcus turned back to the security guard. He thought about several things in that moment, about Gerald Fenn's observation about the most dangerous person in the room, about the plasterwork ceiling he had helped restore, about the $8 million that had made this evening possible, about the woman in the sapphire gown who had once told him she found the whole enterprise desperately performative. He thought about all of it, and he made a decision. "Of course," he said quietly, and walked out. He did not look back. He did not need to. Outside the Grand Palladian, the night air was clean and a little cool, carrying the particular quality that arrived in the city in late October, when the heat finally relented and everything became slightly more itself. Marcus stood on the marble steps and looked at the street, at the procession of cars and the distant sound of the city doing what it always did, and he called Gerald Fenn in Portugal, which was 5 hours later and therefore not a reasonable hour. And Gerald picked up on the third ring because he always had. "Tell me," Gerald said without preamble, the way he always had. Marcus told him, There was a long silence, the transatlantic kind that carries texture. "And what did you do?" Gerald asked. "I walked out." "Good," Gerald said. "Now, what are you going to do next?" Marcus looked at the marble steps beneath his feet, the same marble that had been selected by the property group's renovation committee from a supplier in which, as it happened, Marcus also held a minority stake, because that was simply how a career of 20 years built itself, in connected concentric circles you eventually lost track of. And he made a quiet, final decision. "Something proportionate," he said. He did not tell Gerald what he meant. Gerald, who had known him for 17 years, did not ask. He simply said, "Good night, Marcus," and the line went to silence, and Marcus called a car and went home to the house that was registered in his name, because that was one of the things Vivian had never gotten around to worrying about. In the days that followed, the city moved with its habitual indifference to individual dramas. Vivian returned from the gala at 2 in the morning, energized and flushed with the specific triumph of an event that had gone precisely as planned. She was surprised to find Marcus in the kitchen, at the counter, with a cup of tea and the collected stillness of someone who had been sitting in one place for some time. "It went beautifully," she said, and it was not a performance. The success was real, and for a moment she seemed genuinely pleased to have someone to tell. "I'm glad," Marcus said, and meant it. She paused, her coat half removed, reading something in his quietness. "Are you upset?" "No," he said, which was true. What he felt was not upset. What he felt was clear. She studied him for another moment, then seemed to decide the conversation could wait. "We should talk tomorrow," she said. "Yes," said Marcus, "we should." He had known for several months that the marriage had reached a point of genuine reckoning. The gala had not created that reckoning. It had simply made it visible in a form that could no longer be managed through patience or the careful renegotiation of expectations. He did not approach what came next with anger. He approached it the way he approached all significant decisions, with preparation, precision, and the understanding that the goal was a clean, honest outcome rather than a satisfying performance. He contacted his attorney, a woman named Claire Osei, who had handled his corporate and personal legal matters for 9 years, and who was among the most formidably competent people Marcus had ever worked with, which was a list with very high entry requirements. He told her what he needed. She asked several careful questions, took 3 days to construct a picture of the marital estate, and then delivered her assessment with the directness Marcus had always valued in her. "She has no awareness of the scope," Claire said. "Not a question." "None," Marcus confirmed. Claire was quiet for a moment. "That changes the landscape considerably." "I know. Are you sure this is what you want?" "I'm sure," said Marcus. "I want it done properly, and I want it done without cruelty. Those two things are not contradictory." "No," Claire said. "They're not. Give me 2 weeks." In those 2 weeks, Marcus continued to live in the house, to have breakfast at the same hour, to leave at the same time. He and Vivian had several conversations that were notable for their civility and their increasing honesty, which was the specific variety of honesty that arrives when two people have both decided something is over and are determining whether they can remain decent while it concludes. He told her he thought they had become different people heading in opposite directions. She agreed, which surprised him slightly and did not surprise him at all. He asked her if the distance of the past year had been as obvious to her as it had felt to him. She said yes, and then said something that he thought about for a long time afterward, that she had begun, somewhere in the momentum of everything she was building, to make decisions about people based on where they fit in the architecture of the life she was constructing, and that she had applied that framework to him without noticing, and that it was not an excuse, but it was what had happened. He said that he understood. He did. He did not tell her in those 2 weeks about Meridian Crest or the hotel or the corporate sponsorships or any of the rest of it. That was not what those conversations were for. Those conversations were for two people trying to dissolve something with care. The other matter was separate. The other matter arrived on the morning of the 41st day after the gala in the form of a scheduled meeting at the Grand Palladian Hotel's executive conference suite, which was on the 14th floor and had the same view of the terrace that Marcus had been observing from the ballroom the night Vivian's guards had shown him the door. The meeting had been arranged through Meridian Crest's office, through channels that meant the Grand Palladian's general manager and two members of the property group's operating board had received formal notice that a principal investor required a strategic consultation. These meetings happened periodically. They were not unusual. The unusual element was that Vivian Cho Events had been invited to present at the same meeting because the property group was in early discussions about formalizing a preferred vendor relationship for the hotel's event calendar, a relationship that would represent a significant contract for Vivian's firm, one she had been quietly pursuing for several months through Dominic's connections. Neither Vivian nor Dominic knew who the principal investor was. Vivian arrived with Dominic and a junior associate, professionally impeccable, carrying a presentation that Marcus had no doubt was excellent. They were 15 minutes early. The hotel's events liaison seated them in the conference suite and brought coffee and told them the investor's representative would join them shortly. Marcus arrived precisely on time. He came through the conference suite door in a charcoal suit that was the suit he wore when he wanted people to understand something had changed. It was not louder than his usual clothing. It was the same quiet excellence, but calibrated, the kind of suit that announced to those with the vocabulary to read it that the person wearing it had chosen it with complete intention. He was accompanied by Claire Osei and a man named Thomas Birch, who was the managing director of the property investment group and one of a handful of people in the city who knew exactly what Marcus Hale was worth. He watched the moment unfold across Vivian's face. The recognition arrived in stages, because that was how this kind of recognition worked. The first stage was simple identification, I know this person, and the second stage was contextual disruption, why is this person here? And the third stage was the slow seismic reassembly of a picture that had been assembled incorrectly from the start. He watched all three stages cross Vivian's face in a span of perhaps 4 seconds, and then he watched the fourth stage, which had no easy name. It was the stage where understanding arrived in its full dimensions and took everything with it. Dominic was one step behind. He looked from Marcus to Thomas Birch to Claire Osei, and then back to Marcus, and the expression on his face underwent a reconstruction that involved, Marcus noted, a very brief but very complete moment of genuine understanding of exactly what he had done, in the hotel bar, in the car, in every room where he had performed his assessment of Marcus Hale's relevance, and found it wanting. Marcus took his seat. He accepted coffee from the liaison. He folded his hands on the table in the unhurried, entirely at-home manner of a man in his own space, because he was, in a genuine and legal sense, partly in his own space. Thomas Birch opened the meeting. He introduced Claire Osei. He introduced Marcus with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone delivering a description of the weather, because to Thomas, who had known Marcus for 9 years, there was nothing remarkable about the situation, except that it had not been clarified earlier. Marcus Hale, principal investor and founding architect of the Meridian Property Group, which holds the majority interest in the Grand Palladian Hotel and its associated properties. Marcus is also the operating trustee of Meridian Crest Philanthropic Trust, which you may know as the primary endowment benefactor of the Hartwell Foundation. A brief pause. He wanted to be present for today's conversation personally. The silence in the conference room had a specific texture. It was the silence of people who had undergone a rapid and total reassessment of a situation and had not yet determined how to speak inside the new version of it. Vivian said his name, just his name, quietly, in the way that contains an entire architecture of things that cannot be said in a professional setting, and possibly ever. Marcus looked at her and his expression was not triumph. He was careful about that. He had thought about this moment, about what he wanted to carry into it and what he did not, and he had decided that what he wanted was not her distress. What he wanted was truth. What he wanted was for the room to know what it was actually standing on. I thought it was time, Marcus said simply, to stop being invisible. Dominic opened his mouth and closed it. He was a man who survived on articulation, and articulation had left him completely. I want to be clear, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the meeting room register of someone who had run 10,000 such conversations, that today's discussion about the preferred vendor arrangement is entirely on its merits. Vivian's firm is excellent. The work speaks for itself, and that's the basis on which any contract should be awarded. I don't make business decisions based on personal considerations." He looked around the table with the even, assessing attention he brought to boardrooms. "But I did think it was important for everyone in this room to have complete information. Going forward, that seems more useful than the alternative." The meeting proceeded. It was, in many ways, excellent. Vivian's presentation was precisely as good as Marcus had expected it to be, because she was genuinely extraordinary at what she did, and the professional respect he had always had for her work did not waver simply because the marriage had not survived. The property group's events team asked intelligent questions. Claire Osei made several useful observations about contract structure. Thomas Birch was his usual precise self. Dominic said very little. When he did speak, his voice had lost the quality it usually carried, that middle register of confident authority, the one that had once told Marcus to find a quiet corner and let his wife work. What replaced it was something more careful and significantly less comfortable, the voice of a man recalibrating in real time with limited information and poor odds. After the meeting, in the corridor outside the conference suite, Vivian found Marcus alone for a moment. Claire had gone ahead to deal with a call, and Thomas was speaking with the hotel's general manager at the elevator bank. "How long?" she asked. Not accusatory, something more complicated than that. "The Hartwell endowment was 3 years ago," Marcus said. "The hotel stake goes back further. The rest accumulated the way things do." She absorbed this. "You never told me." "I told you I worked in investment. I told you I had a trust structure I used for philanthropic work. I told you the firm had a quiet operating model." He said this without reproach. "Some of the details were yours to ask about." She looked at him, and what was in her face was not, he thought, the kind of pain that came from being wronged. It was the other kind, the kind that arrived when you realized you had been wrong, which was harder to carry and infinitely more instructive. "I made assumptions," she said. "Yes," said Marcus, "about who you were in rooms, about what you were worth." The word landed with all its ambiguity intact. "About whether you belonged." "Yes," said Marcus again. She looked out the window at the terrace, at the city beyond it, at the view that Marcus had always privately thought was one of the finest in the building. "The night of the gala," she said, She stopped. "It's all right," Marcus said, and he meant it, because the truth was it had hurt, but it had also clarified, and the clarity was worth more than the hurt had cost. "It's not," she said. "It wasn't." She said it with the precision of someone determining a fact rather than assigning blame. "It was wrong. I was wrong. I let someone else decide what you were, and I chose the arrangement over the truth, and that was wrong." She paused. "I'm sorry, Marcus." He looked at her, this woman he had loved, who was brilliant and capable, and who had made a serious error in the currency she had used to measure people. And he said, "I know you are." The divorce proceeded through Claire's office with the collaborative efficiency of two people who had decided that what they owed each other at the end was honesty and decency. The financial settlement was fair, structured to give Vivian the security to build her firm without the shadow of what had come before, because Marcus had never been interested in punishment. He was interested in proportion, and proportion here meant she left the marriage in a position to become whatever she was going to become without the weight of his resources as either a crutch or a grievance. There were consequences in other rooms. When the property group formalized its preferred vendor arrangement with Vivian Cho Events, the associated announcement included a standard disclosure of investor relationships. Dominic Farrell, who had spent his career in the city's event and hospitality world, found that the story had preceded him in ways that were difficult to manage. Not through any action of Marcus's, Marcus had told no one anything, but through the simple operation of a professional community that talked. People who had been in the conference room spoke to people who had not. The arithmetic of Dominic's behavior over the previous 2 years, laid against the revelation of who Marcus Hale actually was, produced a result that Dominic's confidence had not anticipated, and his reputation took considerable time to absorb. Sandra Achebe called Marcus 3 months after the gala, after the divorce had been finalized, and after the Hartwell Foundation's annual report had been filed with a disclosure about Meridian Crest that the board had collectively decided, in light of recent developments, to make slightly less opaque. She called because she had figured it out, and she was the kind of person who confronted things directly. "I want to say thank you," she said. "Properly. Now that I can. You've been building something important, Marcus said. The thanks belongs there. The work is ours, Sandra said. The foundation that made the work possible, that's something else. Marcus thought about that. A good investment is one where you believe in the trajectory before the destination is visible, he said. I believed in yours a long time ago. She laughed, which was a warm and genuine sound. Are you always this impossible to properly thank? I've been told it's a quality, he said. He moved in the months that followed back into the life he had always actually been living, with the quiet difference that it was now visible to anyone who cared to look. He did not pursue a higher profile, that was not who he was. But he stopped calibrating his presence for other people's comfort, stopped standing at the edges of rooms where he had every right to stand at the center, stopped allowing the assumptions of people who read surfaces to go uncorrected simply because correcting them felt performative. Gerald Fenn called him on the 6-month anniversary of the Gala, a coincidence probably, though with Gerald you were never entirely certain. The most dangerous investor in any room, Gerald said by way of opening, is the one nobody is watching. I remember, Marcus said. I want to add something I should have told you then. A pause, transatlantic, textured. But sometimes the right thing is to let them see you, not for their sake, for yours. Marcus sat in his office, the real one, the one with the city spread below it and the discreet meridian crest letterhead on the desk, and the framed photograph of a coastal Portuguese village that Gerald had sent him 12 years ago as a joke that had become, over time, a genuine comfort. He sat in his office and thought about what it meant to be seen and what it cost to remain invisible, and what the difference was between patience and erasure. I'm learning that, he said. Good, said Gerald Fenn from 5 hours in the future. You were always a slow study on the things that mattered. There is a kind of power that announces itself through noise, through display, through the performance of dominance, through the careful architecture of rooms designed to tell you who belongs and who does not. It is a power that requires constant maintenance. It is afraid at its center of the quiet. And then there is the other kind, the kind that does not need the room to know its name, the kind that has been building something steadily in the spaces between other people's attention for years and years. The kind that walks out of a ballroom with its dignity intact because it has never needed the ballroom's permission to be what it is. Marcus Hale was shown the door of a room he partly owned by a woman who loved him inadequately in front of 400 people who did not know his name. He walked out without a scene, without a word of protest, without any of the performance that the moment might have invited. He walked out because he understood something that the room did not, which was that where you stood in any given evening was infinitely less important than what you were standing on. The ground beneath that gala, the foundation's endowment, the hotel's restored ceiling, the light designed at his quiet suggestion, the banners of the companies he had believed in before they were worth believing in, that ground was his. Not in the way of a man claiming territory, in the way of a man who had built something and then simply lived near it without requiring it to announce itself on his behalf. He had not asked the world to know who he was. He had simply kept doing the work, kept building the things worth building, kept being the person he had decided to be in rooms full of people deciding the same. And in the end, the world had found out anyway. The world always did. Not because someone announced it, but because the things you build with integrity eventually become large enough to see from the outside, and when the light falls on them at the right angle, they reflect back something that cannot be mistaken for anything other than what it is. Which is to say, the truth has a way of being present in a room long before anyone introduces it. It was there the whole evening, in the ceiling, in the walls, in the banners hanging from the rafters, in the marble beneath every polished shoe. Marcus Hale walked out, but he was never actually gone. If this story stayed with you, I want to know what moment hit hardest. Drop it in the comments below. And if you believe that real worth doesn't announce itself but eventually gets seen, give this video a like so others can find it. New stories go up every week, and if you're not subscribed yet, this is the right moment. Wherever you're watching from tonight, thank you for being here.